Sometime in the early 1900s, a Skidi Pawnee man named James Murie opened one of his people's most sacred bundles, and inside, folded among the holy objects, was a piece of tanned elk skin painted with stars. It was not large, only about the size of a big book, but its darkened surface was scattered with hundreds of small marks, arranged in careful groups across the hide. A band of faint dots ran down the middle like a river of light. To the priests who kept it, this skin was not decoration and not a curiosity. It was part of a bundle that held the order of the world, brought out only with prayer. And when scholars later studied it, some came to believe they were looking at something with no known equal on the continent, a picture of the night sky drawn by native hands before Europeans ever reached the plains, perhaps the oldest surviving star chart made anywhere in North America. But others looked at the same painted skin and said it was never meant to be read as a map at all. So which is it? A chart of the real heavens, or a diagram of a sacred story? And how did one people come to carry the whole sky folded inside a bundle? To follow that question honestly, we have to start not with the meaning, but with the object, with the painted skin itself and the people who kept it. The chart is a piece of tanned elk hide, roughly 15 by 22 inches, small enough to hold in two hands. Across its smoke-darkened surface are painted stars, drawn as 4 pointed and 5 pointed marks, and their sizes vary. Some are large, some are small, and that variation appears to be deliberate, with the biggest mark standing for the brightest stars in the sky. Down the center runs a band of many small dots, which most people who have studied the skin read as the Milky Way, the pale river of light that arches across a clear, dark night. Grouped across the rest of the hide are clusters and figures that have been matched, with more or less confidence, to real things overhead. A tight little knot of stars that looks like the Pleiades, a curved crown of stars, a great square, and the bright singular points that the Pawnee knew as great beings in their own right. It is, whatever else it is, a careful and intentional arrangement of the night sky on skin. The people who made and kept it are the Skidi, one of the bands of the Pawnee, who lived along the Loup and Platte rivers in what is now Nebraska. The Pawnee were farmers and hunters who lived in villages of large domed earth lodges, homes built of a heavy timber frame packed with earth, big enough to hold several families along with their stored corn and their horses. A single lodge could be 40 or 50 feet across, a round earthen dome with a low-covered entrance and a fire pit at the center, and from the outside, a Pawnee town looked like a cluster of grassy hills rising from the river terrace. These were not temporary shelters. They were substantial buildings, rebuilt over years, and the way they were laid out and oriented was itself an expression of the Skidi's beliefs about the shape of the world. And the Skidi were, by any measure, among the most sky-focused peoples in North America. Their religion, their calendar, their planting, their villages, and their sacred bundles were all bound up with the stars, to a degree that still astonishes the scholars who study them. The painted elk skin came out of that world. It was kept in one of the sacred bundles, the wrapped collections of holy objects that sat at the center of Skidi ceremonial life, each one tied to a particular star in a particular village. How the chart came into the record is itself part of the story, and it turns on one remarkable man. James Murie was a Skidi Pawnee, educated in the outside world but deeply rooted in his own people's knowledge, and in the early 1900s, he worked to document Pawnee ceremony and belief from the inside, in partnership with anthropologists at institutions including the Field Museum in Chicago. The chart passed into the Field Museum, where it has remained, and where it was later studied and catalogued by the anthropologist Ralph Linton. Because a Skidi man was central to recording it, the chart comes down to us with an unusually direct thread back to the people who understood what it was for, which is rare for objects of this kind in this age. So the physical facts are these. A small painted elk skin, covered in stars, with a river of dots down its middle, drawn by the Skidi Pawnee and kept in a sacred bundle, now preserved in a museum in Chicago. Held up to the light, the little marks catch the eye one by one, brighter and fainter, exactly as stars do on a clear night. What people cannot agree on is how old it is, and what precisely it was made to do. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a single object and follow it carefully, with real sources and real respect for the people it belongs to, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because when scholars first tried to read the chart as a true map of the heavens, the claim they made about it was breathtaking. Early in the study of the skin, an interpreter matched its clusters to real constellations and argued that the chart was essentially a picture of the actual sky, with winter star groups gathered toward one side and summer groups toward the other, the Milky Way down the center, and the sizes of the painted stars recording their real brightness. On that reading, the little knot near one edge is the Pleiades, that same tight cluster peoples all over the world have watched for thousands of years. A curved line of stars becomes a crown the Pawnee called the Council of Chiefs. A great sprawling figure becomes the stretch of stars we call the Big Dipper. And the bright lone points become the morning star and the evening star and the star that does not move, the one we call the North Star, which the Pawnee understood as a chief who holds the sky in place while everything else wheels around him. The curved crown itself, the group of stars we call the Northern Crown, the Pawnee knew as the Council of Chiefs, A circle of star leaders seated in council in the sky exactly as the human chiefs sat in council on the ground. That single detail captures the whole Skidi way of seeing. The order they kept among themselves, the circle of leaders making decisions for the people, was not something they invented. It was a copy of an order they read in the stars, a pattern set overhead by Tarawa and meant to be matched below. To find that idea painted onto the elk-skin, a council in the sky drawn beside a river of light, is to see a people's politics and their astronomy written in the same hand. If that reading is right, then this modest piece of elk-skin is a genuine chart of the night sky, made by native people on the plains before European contact, and estimates put it at 3 centuries old or more, which would make it the oldest surviving depiction of the heavens created anywhere in North America. For a single painted hide, that is an astonishing thing to be. And it is exactly the kind of claim that an honest documentary has to test, rather than celebrate. Because when other scholars examined the same skin, they pushed back hard, and their objection is a good one. The astronomer Vondel Chamberlain, who wrote the major modern study of Pawnee sky knowledge, and the anthropologist Douglas Parks, a leading authority on the Pawnee language, both concluded that the chart was probably never intended to be a working map of the sky. Look closely, they argued, and the problems appear. The star groups are not placed at their correct distances or angles from one another. You could not hold this skin up on a dark night and use it to find your way around the heavens, because it is not to scale and it is not a projection of the real dome overhead. What it looks like instead, they suggested, is a conceptual picture of the sky, a sacred diagram that gathers the important stars together in one view, most likely used by Skidi priests as a kind of memory aid, a way to hold and recount the order of the heavens and the origin story bound up with it. On that reading, the chart is not a map at all, but something closer to an icon, a holy summary of the cosmos, rather than a chart you could navigate by. And that reframing matters, because it would mean the skin was made to serve a ceremony and a story, not astronomy in our narrow sense. The honest position sits in the tension between these two readings. The chart is clearly about the real stars, drawn by people who watched them closely, and it is clearly not a literal map you could steer by. It is something in between, and the argument over exactly where it falls is not settled. But step back from the skin itself, and the deeper truth is that the Skidi did not need this one hide to prove how completely they lived by the sky, because they built their whole world around it. Because the real wonder is not the chart alone, but the civilization it came from. And here, the physical evidence and the Skidi's own account of themselves line up almost point for point. To the Skidi Pawnee, the stars were not distant lights. They were living powers, placed in the sky by the Creator, whom they called Tirawa, and given the task of ordering the world and bringing the first people into being. In the Skidi origin story, the morning star, a fierce male power in the east, and the evening star, a female power in the west, were brought together, and from their union came the first human being, a girl. The great stars were not symbols of the gods. In this understanding, they were the gods watching from the sky. And the Skidi arranged their earthly life to match the arrangement of those powers overhead. Their confederation of villages was tied to the stars, with leading villages associated with particular stars, and holding the sacred bundle that belonged to each, so that the map of Skidi towns on the ground echoed the map of powers in the sky. Even the home itself was built as a model of the heavens. The Pawnee Earth Lodge was a dome, like the dome of the sky, and its 4 great central posts were painted and understood to stand for the 4 stars of the semi-cardinal directions, the powers that hold up the corners of the world. And at the top of the lodge was the smoke hole, and through that opening the priests watched the stars. By tracking when certain stars appeared in the smoke hole or across the sky, the keepers of the bundles knew when to hold ceremonies, and crucially, when to plant. The rising of the Pleiades and the movement of other star groups told an agricultural people living by their corn exactly when the season had turned. The Skidi had names and roles for the ones that mattered. A pair of stars low in the spring sky they called the swimming ducks, whose return was a sign that the year was waking up. The tight cluster of the Pleiades they watched as a single family of stars gathered together, and the 4 great stars of the semi-cardinal directions, the ones the 4 painted posts of the lodge stood for, were understood to hold up the corners of the sky and to send the first storms and the power of life into the world. When a priest looked up through the smoke hole on the right night and saw the expected star hanging where it should be, he was not stargazing. He was reading a clock and a calendar that his people had checked and corrected across untold generations, and acting on it, calling the village to plant or to gather or to begin a ceremony. That is not decoration. That is a working observational astronomy, carried out by patient watching over many generations, a genuine science kept without telescopes or writing. The obvious objection is worth meeting directly. How could a people without instruments come to know the sky so precisely? And the answer is the least mysterious part of the whole story. They looked carefully, night after night, year after year, from the fixed frame of the smoke hole and the horizon, and they passed what they learned down through the priests and the bundles, until the sky was as familiar to them as their own fields. Some of that ceremony reached into places that are painful to recount, including the rare and solemn morning star ceremony, in which a captive was sacrificed to the power of the dawn, a practice the Pawnee themselves moved away from and had largely set aside by the early 1800s. Remembered in part because a Pawnee man is said to have intervened to stop one such rite. It is part of the history, and it should be told with care and without sensationalism, as the serious religious act it was to the people who performed it, not as a lurid detail. And it would be wrong to reach past all of this for stranger explanations, of lost sky teachers or visitors from other worlds, because the real explanation, generations of human beings watching the real sky from the roof of a lodge, is more impressive than any of them. None of the deepest questions about the chart are fully closed, and that is where a careful film should leave them. We cannot fix its exact age, we cannot prove whether it was drawn as a map or as a sacred diagram, and we cannot recover every star name and story that the priests once carried. What we can do is separate the solid ground from the open questions. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. There's a painted elk skin covered in stars, made by the Skidi Pawnee, kept in one of their sacred bundles, and now preserved in the Field Museum in Chicago. It shows a central band widely read as the Milky Way, and groups of stars including a cluster that matches the Pleiades. It was documented with the help of James Murie, a Skidi Pawnee, and studied by later scholars including Ralph Linton, Chamberlain, and Douglas Parks. And the people who made it built their villages, their homes, and their calendar around careful watching of the stars. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know exactly how old the chart is, though estimates reach back 3 centuries or more before European contact. We do not know for certain whether it was ever meant to be read as a true map of the sky or only as a ceremonial picture of it. And we do not know how much of the vast Skidi sky knowledge was lost in the hard generations of removal and change, when the Pawnee were pushed from their Nebraska homeland south into what is now Oklahoma, where the Pawnee Nation lives today. Visit the story of the chart now, and it lives in 2 places at once, in a climate-controlled drawer in a Chicago museum, and in the ongoing life of the Pawnee people who remain connected to this heritage. The painted stars are still there on the skin, bright and faint, just as they were drawn, a whole sky folded small enough to hold in the hands. History is rarely settled by a single object, and some objects hold more than any single reading can contain. It is assembled slowly, one bundle, one interpretation, one honored tradition at a time, and sometimes the most honest thing to say is that a thing is both a map and a prayer, and we are still learning to read it. The Skidi Pawnee star chart sits in that space, its stars real, its purpose debated, its people still here. The stars were real, the watching was real, the knowledge was real. Thank you for looking at the painted sky with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that follow one object into the world that made it, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a people paint the whole sky onto a piece of skin and lay out their towns and their homes to match it, are they drawing a map of the heavens, or are they drawing a picture of who they believe they are?